Pressing for democratic reform requires tenacity and creativity. It's also helpful if you survive attempts on your life. In the instance of Russian democracy activist Vladimir Kara-Murza, he's done that twice now, though his colleague and friend, Russian opposition leader Boris Nemstsov, did not. He was assassinated 4 years ago. Vladimir Kara-Murza is chair of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom and vice chair of the civil society movement Open Russia. He's also a former deputy leader of Russia's People's Freedom Party and a past candidate for the Russian State Duma. He joins us now on his current efforts to advance democracy in that country. It's so nice to meet you.
It's great to be in your program. Thank you for inviting me.
Здравствуйте.
Добрый день.
You came close to dying after having been poisoned twice in 2015, 2017. How close?
Well, on both occasions I was in a coma with a multiple organ failure. The official diagnosis that I was given in the Moscow hospital was toxic action by an unidentified substance, which, translated from medical into normal language means poisoning. And both times doctors told my wife that I had about a 5% chance to survive. So when I say that I'm happy to be here today, I really mean this. But, I'm one of the lucky ones. Unfortunately, many of our friends and colleagues in Russian civil society, in Russian independent journalism, in Russian opposition, have been less fortunate. And, I had the 5% chance to survive, which I did.
You're sure the state was behind this?
Well, all I can say is, this was done in a very sophisticated fashion with something, with a very strong poisonous substance, which, I presume you just can't go and get in a pharmacy somewhere. And I have absolutely no doubt that this was done as retribution to my political activities in Russian opposition.
Let me ask you about those. It was 4 years ago, as we suggested, that your friend Boris Nemtsov was gunned down within, spitting distance of the Kremlin. What does this say about Russia today?
Well, frankly, when people start talking about the state of democracy, rule of law, and human rights in Russia today under Vladimir Putin's regime, we can talk a long time about the media censorship and the electoral fraud and the clampdown on the freedom of assembly and so on and so forth. But frankly, I think it's enough to say that, if the leader of the opposition, the most prominent leader of the political opposition, former deputy prime minister, four-term member of parliament, is gunned down 200 yards from the Kremlin wall, and 4 years on, none of the organizers or masterminds of that crime have been identified or brought to justice, and we can see that they enjoy the full protection from the top of the Russian state. Frankly, I think there's nothing else to say about the state of the rule of law and democracy in Russia. And, but the important thing is that people shouldn't equate the regime that we have in Russia today and Russia as a nation, Russian society, Russian citizens, because those are two very different things. The Kremlin would like to merge the two. In fact, one of Putin's closest political aides has been on record saying there's no Russia without Putin. It's one of the most insulting, probably the most insulting thing I've ever heard said about my country. But that is just not the case, and I think one of the most evident manifestations of this was actually 2 Sundays ago, at the end of February, when we had the annual March of Remembrance for Boris Nemtsov in Moscow, when thousands of people walked down the Boulevard Ring to remember him, to pay tribute to his legacy, and to demand justice for his case. And the Kremlin has been fighting Boris Nemtsov for the past 4 years since his assassination, just as hard as they were fighting him while he was alive. They're now fighting his memory and his legacy.
Were the demonstrators harassed at all during that protest?
Not at the Remembrance March itself, because I think the Russian authorities have long realized that, whether or not they issue a permit, people will still turn up and still come in the big numbers, in the big thousands. But they are trying to do everything else to try to erase the memory of him, the memory of somebody who embodied and represented a very different vision for Russia, a Russian based on democracy and freedom and respect for the rule of law.
Well, let me ask you about that, because it's hard to believe. It's almost 3 decades since Russia, not came into existence, stopping the Soviet Union and turned into the constituent republics of the old Soviet Union. And democracy looked like it was actually taking hold in Russia. When did that stop being the case?
Well, it stopped being the case when Vladimir Putin came to power. It didn't happen in one day. Mr. Putin was really kind of savvy about it. He heeded the advice once given by Benito Mussolini when he consolidated his own power in Italy in the early 1920s, and when he said, you should pluck the chicken feather by feather to lessen the squawking. That was his advice.
Pluck the chicken feather by feather.
So when Putin came to power, so we had about a decade in the 1990s when we had pluralistic independent media, when we had a genuine parliament that represented a wide spectrum of views in society, when we had free and fair and democratic elections in Russia. I'm old enough to remember that. People who are younger than me don't, because Vladimir Putin has now been in power for 20 years, if you can believe that. And we have an entire generation that has no memory of anything else. So when Putin came to power, he began to pluck that chicken feather by feather. He started with the independent media, which he very quickly shut down or took over all the independent, privately owned nationwide television channels. He very quickly subdued Parliament by ejecting the opposition from it through a fraudulent election that was not free or fair, and that resulted in a Parliament that, in an infamous phrase by its own speaker, is not a place for discussion. Parliament's not a place for discussion. The phrase belongs to Boris Nemstsov, the former Speaker of the Russian State Duma.
The word parliament actually comes from the French parler. That's where you're supposed to speak.
Probably hasn't heard about this, but I think that's going to be one of the phrases that defines the Putin regime in future history books. He then, this was all in the first years of his rule, he then imprisoned the richest man in Russia, a man by the name of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was active in supporting some of those opposition parties and NGOs and civil society and independent media, in a very clear message that, you know, if you're going to behave like him, you're going to end up like him as well. And so all of these things happened in the initial first years of Vladimir Putin's rule. So very, very quickly, I suppose by about 2003, 2004, you know, he managed to transform our country from an imperfect democracy that it was. You know, it had its problems, it had its difficulties, it had its flaws, but it was, you know, a functioning system of democracy and political freedoms. He very quickly turned that imperfect democracy into a perfect dictatorship that we have today. And today we have a country where Parliament is not a place for discussion, where people are imprisoned for their political views. We have more than 200 political and religious prisoners in Russia today, according to human rights groups. You know, where we haven't had a free and fair election for nearly 2 decades now.
So if Russia is going to get back on the path to the kind of democracy that you want to see, what's going to have to happen? So
our work is with Russian society, our work is with Russian citizens, with those people who are coming out every year on the streets to remember and to pay tribute to Boris Nemtsov, with those tens of thousands of young Russians who have been going out to the streets all across our country in the last 2 years to protest against this endemic corruption and the impunity and the lack of transparency and accountability, and the mere fact that, you know, that the same person has now stayed in power for 2 decades.
So Putin's got to go. That's the first part.
Well, absolutely. I mean, he can't get rid of dictatorship without getting rid of the dictator first.
But getting rid of the dictator doesn't necessarily get rid of the dictatorship. How do you get back on that path to democracy, even if Putin's gone?
So our main work now is with the young generation, and this work is underway already today. You know, we're not sitting there and waiting. We are working, because if you look at the past century or so of Russian history, you will see that, you know, major political changes in our country have always begun quickly and unexpectedly. Be it, you know, in 1905, 1917, 1991, which is something I remember myself, when, you know, the Soviet regime, one of the most repressive regimes in the history of humanity, went down in 3 days.
Without even a shot being fired, pretty much.
Well, there were
some, yes,
there were 3 people who were killed. These were the 3 victims of those days. But largely, it was a bloodless revolution, a peaceful democratic revolution of August 1991. And, you know, I was 10 years old at the time, so I was too young to participate, unfortunately. But my father spent all the 3 days and 3 nights at the barricades by the Moscow White House. But I was certainly old enough to see and understand and appreciate the main lesson of what was happening. And that lesson, which is very relevant today too, is that however strong an authoritarian regime, when enough people are willing to stand up and defend their dignity and their freedoms, all that strength and all that authoritarianism becomes meaningless. Because what happened in August of 1991 was that the communist leadership sent literally tanks on the streets of Moscow to try to reestablish their control. And hundreds of thousands of people, of peaceful, unarmed Russians, went out to the streets and stood in front of those tanks. And the tanks stopped.
And I remember Boris Yeltsin standing on top of one of them with a flag, and he was a great hero for a long time. Can I ask you, though, about this? I mean, a lot of polls I've seen say that Mr. Putin is a pretty popular guy, that he has restored, I know you're laughing, but humor me with the question. He's, for those people in Russia who have been very unhappy that Russia is no longer seen as an equivalent superpower to the United States, they see a Russia that is groveling, and they think that Putin has put Russia back on the international stage in a way that they weren't in the post-Gorbachev days. What's your view of that?
Well, let's address this question of so-called popularity of Vladimir Putin. I think it is absolutely meaningless to speak about popularity or opinion polls in an authoritarian system where most people, first of all, have no access to objective information because all nationwide television channels are directly controlled and guided by the government. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, when people are aware of the potential consequences of the response. Just imagine for a second, humor me if I may use the same phrase. Imagine you sit in your apartment, in your kitchen, somewhere in Russia, I don't know, in Tambov or Novosibirsk, or even Moscow, and you know what's happening to those people who actively oppose the current regime. You know that those people are denounced on state television as traitors and foreign agents. You know that they're beaten up at rallies. You know that they're arrested. You know that they can be sacked from their jobs or expelled from universities, and you know that sometimes they are killed.
So you're not
like
likely
Boris
to be honest
Nemstsov
with the, you're not going to be honest with
and
the
you receive a
pollster.
phone call
Yeah.
or a knock on your door, and some person you've never seen before comes in and says, "Hello, I'm from a polling agency. What do you think of Vladimir Putin?" What are you going to say? This is absolutely and utterly meaningless. As my good friend Boris Vishnevsky, who is an opposition lawmaker in St. Petersburg, likes to say, Nicolae Ceausescu, who was a Romanian communist dictator, had 99% approval 2 weeks before he was overthrown in December 1999.
Shot and
I always
killed.
thought this is a nice and sounding phrase. I went and fact-checked it. It is actually true. And so the point of this is, I mean, there are only two ways objectively to measure a leader's popularity in a democratic society. You know, election results and opinion polls. We have neither in Russia. We haven't had a free and fair election for nearly 2 decades now, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at the reports from international observers, from the OSCE or the Council of Europe. And opinion polls are absolutely meaningless for the reasons we've just been discussing. I think, frankly, a far more reliable measurement of the true so-called popularity of the Putin regime is the behavior of the regime itself. Let me ask you a question, if I may. If he was really so popular, why would he need to rig elections all the time? Wouldn't he just be able to win them? Why would he need to censor and control the media to such an extent? If he was so popular, wouldn't he just win the argument? Why do they need to beat up and arrest peaceful demonstrators and anti-government rallies if they're really so strong and popular? No, that's not the behavior of a strong and confident and popular government. That's the behavior of a regime that is, you know, insecure, weak, and afraid. And frankly, looking at all of those young people who have been coming out all across Russia to protest in the last couple of years, I can see why they feel so insecure.
Do you think Donald Trump's behavior has enabled some of what Vladimir Putin has done?
I think, first of all, let's say at the outright, it's only up to us, Russians, to change the situation in Russia. It's not up to anybody in the West, not the US president, not the Canadian prime minister, not any Western leader. The only thing we do expect of Western leaders is that they stand on their own values, that they stay true to their own values. And this is why it was so important a few years ago when both the United States and Canada led the world in adopting legislation called the Magnitsky legislation to put down a very simple principle. The people, foreign government officials, in Russia or anywhere else, who engage in corruption and human rights abuses in their home countries will no longer be allowed to receive visas here, own assets here, or use the financial and banking system here. Because for years, that is exactly what has been happening. The same people who have been abusing and undermining and attacking the most basic norms of democracy and the rule of law in our country have been coming to your countries, to the West, and enjoying the privileges and the benefits of democracy and the rule of law here. And for years, the West and Western leaders have allowed this to happen. And it is very heartening to see, for now it's a small select club, only 6 countries in the world have passed this legislation. We are deeply grateful to all those countries, including Canada.
How well are we doing at sticking to it, though?
The Canadian government has been implementing it, as has the US government, as have governments in Europe. I was proud to have been involved in this work. I came on several occasions here to Canada to testify at the committees before the House of Commons and the Senate in support of the Magnitsky legislation. I've done the same in many other countries of the world. By the way, I think that was the likeliest reason for the 2 attacks on my life, because there's nothing the Kremlin hates more than when you go after their pockets and their bank accounts. And I continue to be engaged in these efforts in the hope that more countries, more Western democracies will send a clear message that these crooks and these human rights abuses will no longer be welcome.
Okay, that aside though, Vladimir, do you allow for the possibility that your vision for democracy in Russia's future may not be shared by as many people in Russia as you would like it to be? Because Russia, what's the old expression? That there's no limit to the amount of suffering the Russian people are prepared to withstand in order to have stability and to be significant players in the world. Do you accept that possibility?
First of all, people who say that, why don't they ask Russians themselves?
Well, I am asking a Russian. Is that true?
Well, I think it's one of the most offensive stereotypes, that Russians want a strong hand, that they don't want political freedom. This is frankly baloney. This is just not borne out by historical facts. Every time the Russian people actually had a chance in a more or less free election to choose between dictatorship and democracy, they chose democracy. 1906, 1917, the Constituent Assembly, 1991, I can go on. So that is just not true. Of course, I obviously accept the fact, I'm a Democrat by conviction. I accept the fact that there are people of other views. And this is normal. A democratic society means that there are different views. The problem today in our country is that, if you are a supporter of Vladimir Putin, you get airtime on national television, you get all sorts of preferences, you get green light for whatever you want to do. If you're an opponent of Vladimir Putin, especially an active and prominent opponent, you can be arrested, beaten up, harassed, imprisoned, or killed, like Boris Nemtsov was 4 years ago.
Your friend, Mr. Nemtsov, I think used to say that if democracy were going to take hold in Russia, it would not happen until the mid-2020s. Why did he point to that part of the calendar?
He always said that, actually, and I remember arguing with him about this because I think maybe it was, back when I was younger, maybe this was the idealism. I always thought things would start quicker and happen quicker. Boris Nemtsov always said that the big political changes in Russia will happen around the mid-2020s. He gave several reasons for this. One of them was a kind of a mystical reason. He wasn't a very mystical person, but in this case, he did give this reason that, just as Moses led his people for 40 years to forget slavery, 40 years since the start of perestroika will be in the mid-2020s. It's only one of the reasons. There are many others. But Boris Nemtsov was here in Canada 7 years ago, just 3 years before he was killed, also to advocate for the Magnitsky Law. He did not live to see the day the Magnitsky Law in Canada came into effect, but I know he would have been proud of that fact. He would have been grateful as well. And actually, the reason I'm here in Canada now on this very short visit for a day and a half is to launch an initiative that has very much, that has everything to do with Boris Nemtsov. So just a couple of hours ago, I was at Toronto City Hall to formally submit an application to name one of the streets here in the city of Toronto after Boris Nemtsov. This has already been done in 3 cities around the world, in Washington, D.C., in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, and in Kiev. Next week I'll be in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, for the unveiling of Boris Nemtsov Square there.
Did they say they would do it?
They have already passed the law. It's just a question of the unveiling. So 3 world capitals have already honored Boris Nemtsov with street designations. And coming back to what we started with, the popular memory, despite the best efforts of the Kremlin, the popular memory of Boris Nemtsov lives on, and best testimony to that were the thousands of people who walked 2 Sundays ago through the streets of Moscow, and the fresh flowers that appear and the candles that are lit every single day on that bridge next to the Kremlin on the spot where he was killed. But on the official level, the Kremlin is trying to do everything it can to erase the memory of Boris Nemtsov, to make people forget. As Vladimir Putin's press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said, Boris Nemtsov was little more than an average citizen. This was his direct quote. And so they're continuing to fight Boris Nemtsov today. And so a few years ago, we have appealed to citizens and political leaders and parliamentarians in free countries to ask them to do what we for now are unable to do at home. And we are so deeply grateful to the authorities in Washington, D.C., in Vilnius, and in Kiev for honoring Boris Nemtsov with street designations.
Vladimir, what does one say but spasiba and do svidaniya?
Spasiba vam.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.